Hey guys, what's up? Sean here. So a little while ago I did a review on the MacBook Pro 16-inch and kind of my impressions of it as a creator and a writer, and there were a few things that I loved about it and a few things that I hated about it. But now I've been using it for about 10 months. I thought it was time that I did another in-depth review because people are always asking me, what tool do I use to do my work? Now this is from the perspective of somebody who does a lot of writing. So my day job is a writer, I'm a self-published author, and I have to type out a lot of words, and that's why the keyboard on this thing is something that I really love. And also as well, on the side, I do all the creation side of it, so the attempt at making YouTube videos, and that's why this sort of thing is a beast. Now, before I upgraded to the 16-inch, I had my old trusty MacBook Pro 2012 Retina display, and I adored this thing. It did so incredibly well for me, it's lasted such a long time, and I still love it. It's like one of my best devices. I've upgraded to multiple different devices over the years. So I've had Surface Book, Surface Pro, I even tried one of the dreaded butterfly keyboard MacBook Pros, and I despised that because of that awful keyboard that just gave you finger fatigue, as I called it in one of my other videos. And I've always ended up going back to this thing. And then the MacBook Pro 16-inch got announced, and it really ticks a lot of the boxes for me. So I'm going to cover off some of the reasons I love this, some of the reasons I like it, and some of the reasons I really dislike it. But overall, why I've stuck with this one now for the past 10 months and I haven't gone back to my old 2012 MacBook Pro. Now, the first thing is, this thing is absolutely gorgeous. It looks the part, it's slim, it's sleek, the screen on it is absolutely stunning. And the biggest thing for me, like I said, I do a lot of typing, so that typing experience needs to be spot on for me. And the keyboard on this is, it's beautiful. So they went back and finally Apple ditched the dreaded butterfly keyboard, and like I said, you just have to use one of those for a prolonged length of time, and it just absolutely, it's awful. It's like typing on just a table. There's no give to them, there's no travel to the key, there's no depth, and it just kind of starts to send a bit of shock up your hands. And when you're doing a lot of typing every single day, it just becomes tiresome. Then there are the reliability issues as well. So I was absolutely over the moon when Apple went back to just a standard scissor keyboard. You know, don't fix it if it ain't broken, all of that. But you know, Apple kind of wanted to go for slim, and in the process they basically killed off 4 years of MacBooks, which is a bit of a nightmare. This thing has nice enough travel on it. It's not the most, I guess, deep keyboard in the world, but it is nice. The keycap size is just right as well, so the typing experience, I feel really accurate on it. I can get my word flow going as well, and it just feels nice to type on. You don't get that unusual fatigue that you'd normally get. Now granted, I kind of cheat, so I have this little beastie on the bottom of it, which kind of flops out like so, and it allows me to angle and type at that angle, and I absolutely love that. Having it flat, I guess with any of the devices, I've always had this sort of thing on the bottom of it just because I like to have an angle. It's one thing that I really appreciated on the old Surface Pro, being able to angle that keyboard, so that sort of thing helps. But the keyboard overall, I absolutely love it. Touch ID is a nice little extra as well, although I do use my Apple Watch to authenticate my MacBook when I get into it, but it's nice there for password entry and all of that. Then there's the touch bar, which kind of brings me on to something that I'm not overly keen on. I don't hate it. Some people absolutely despise the touch bar, but I just don't feel it adds much. You know, even when I go down to editing movie and stuff like that on here, I don't use it for any of those quick keys. It just kind of gets in the way, but I don't hate it, I don't love it, but it's just there. But that keyboard, beautiful. Trackpad, massive. Absolutely love Apple's trackpads. Through and through, they are the best in the industry. The gestures on them are fantastic. The force touch on them as well. It just feels like I'm using a physical keypad, but you're not. It's some kind of wizardry, and I absolutely love it. However, it does bring me on to one of my biggest complaints, and especially if you do a lot of writing. I'll be partway through writing something on a paragraph, and then you end up leaning your hands on that trackpad because it's just so massive. It takes up pretty much the whole of the bottom of this thing. And the amount of times that I'll then go back to typing, and suddenly I'm typing kind of partway up my page or back the way I've just come, and it's really frustrating. The trackpad is just a little bit too big. I mean, I like it being big. You don't want to go back to those tiny little ones, but my God, Apple, just, you know, rein it in a little bit, or at least improve your sort of, I guess, the detection for your palms. It's there, but it's not there all the time. And especially when you take that pause between, you know, thinking about what you're going to write next, because I kind of have to. I'm not magic. you just end up with that detection on there, which is really frustrating. So another thing to mention, and it's something that crops up every single time MacBooks kind of come into the conversation, is the USB-C situation there. So obviously you don't get much in the way of universal ports. You don't get anything apart from their headphone jack, which is kind of weird considering Apple despise headphone jacks, but hey, here we are. And it just means you need to live the dongle life, and I don't mind that. You know, the dongle life is fine at the end of the day, and I can live with that. It's very rare that I need to plug anything into this, so it's not too much of an issue. However, I do sometimes get port envy when I see other devices, you know, your Windows manufacturers. They somehow manage to keep the same sort of form factor or a little bit slimmer, and they still get USB-A, the full-size HDMI, full-size Ethernet. They managed to get that in there, Apple doesn't. And I get it, it looks nice and all of that, but I do sometimes miss it. But that's more the envious side of me than anything else. So from the writer's perspective, that keyboard is absolutely killer for me, and I love it. It is the best keyboard I've used since my MacBook Pro 2012, and I've got to say, you know, hands down, Apple have finally brought back a decent keyboard on their devices, which has been a long time coming because it's been so frustrating. Screen size is pretty much spot on as well. I really like it for on-the-go usage. I use this all around the house. I've got 2 kids, so you know what, though I've got my office and it's lovely to work in here, yeah, kids are gonna get you. They are gonna get you and drag you back downstairs. So having this and the decent size for it is really handy. It does sometimes feel a little bit too large and heavy, especially going from something like the 13-inch MacBook Pro that I had beforehand. But there's not a massive amount I can do for that. For the writing side of it, that's when it feels a little bit too big. I don't necessarily need all of that screen real estate. And for the creation side of it, that's when it comes in really handy, and I absolutely love to have that additional screen real estate there. For creating movies, flipping through my timeline and all of that, it is so nice to have that extra space on there to work in. Writing, not so much, but everything else, and especially creation, doing things like the thumbnails, some of the photo editing that I do and the video editing, having that screen size is amazing, and it does such a good job. So for those of you who saw my initial impressions and my, I guess, hands-on after a few months with this device, will know that I had a few issues that were driving me mad. And the first one was that when I closed the lid, 9 out of 10 times when I came back to use the device, it would have crashed and reset and I'd have lost where I was at the time. And although macOS does a pretty good job at recovering exactly where I was at, there were quite a few times where I would lose the work I've been working on, and it was just driving me crazy. It got to the stage where I was constantly having to leave the device open because I didn't want to leave it behind just in case it reset itself. Glad to say a software update came out and it fixed that, so that's no longer an issue. The other thing I had the crackly speakers of death where you'd sometimes start playing something, you have to, and it'd be like, bump up the volume, bump it back down, and it'd go back to normal. Again, that's now gone as well, so it seems as though they were software issues, so not a massive deal. But there are some that I have discovered over time, and these things are quite frustrating, especially when you start to consider how much this device costs. Now, I have the terabyte version. It's an i9 processor with the 5500 4 gig, I believe it is, and overall performance is fantastic. And they brag about this massive battery in here, but this massive battery in real world use, at least for me, is just, it's really poor, especially for anybody who's used to previous Macs. So even my 2012 MacBook Pro still does a pretty good job on its battery life, and any Mac I've used before, I had the MacBook Air, I had the MacBook Pro, they've always delivered exceptional battery life, but this just, it doesn't live up to my expectations. And what I will find is, fortunately, I tend to be around the house a lot, so I can always plug it in. But if I had to try and get a full working day from this, it's just not going to happen. There's no way that this can deliver it. And I can definitely tell that it's down to, I suppose, thermal limitations and everything else. They've gone just a little bit too slim for it because it gets hot. There's sometimes where I'll just be using it and for word processing and nothing else, and the device is just heating up, and it doesn't become uncomfortable because it tends to be focused along the top bar and everything below it is relatively cool, but you can tell it's taking a bit of a caning. If I use an external monitor, then it heats up even more, and it's a known issue for these devices, which is a bit of a pain, that it suddenly starts to absolutely chew through the battery, so you absolutely must have it plugged in. But on the go, I definitely wouldn't be able to get a full day's battery life of just word processing, and that's a bit disappointing because I've always been able to get that before. I would need to plug it in, so you know, take that how you will. It all comes down to your usage, how much you're going to be using it. but I spend a lot of time on this, and the battery life in comparison to any other Apple device that I've used previously just isn't up to scratch. Another thing to consider as well is whether or not you use Boot Camp. So if you're going to be running Windows on this device, that's when things can become really tricky. And I do use Boot Camp on this. I use it occasionally for a little bit of gaming when I'm around the house and I'm not on my gaming PC. And this is absolutely abysmal when it comes to gaming on, and it's definitely not going to be a selling point. You're probably not going to be looking at buying a MacBook Pro for gaming. There's not going to be many people out there, but it's a nice to have, and on previous models I've been able to do that. With this device, what I tend to find is there's a couple of issues. So first one is that it will window it into like a corner of my screen, so unless I play at the device's full native resolution, it won't go full screen. And if it goes at the full native resolution, it'll run like a dead dog, because obviously it's just not powerful enough to do that. The other thing that I find is doing anything in Windows, and especially gaming, is it's just not optimized for it. So it discharges its battery faster than you can charge it, and that's with the beastie like 100-watt charger. It can't keep up with it. The processor and the graphics card combined use up more battery than this thing can possibly charge up, and it creates a really poor experience. So if you're somebody who needs this to run Windows every so often, and especially on the go, just bear in mind you will get appalling battery life, like abysmal. It's relatively average and not what I'd hope for in macOS. But on Windows through Boot Camp, your battery life will be diabolical. To put it into, perspective, when I do any form of gaming, it will always give me less than an hour's battery life. So from 100% through to 0, it's always less than an hour. And also you expect gaming to kind of cane it quite a bit. But the moment you boot into Windows on this, the fans ramp up, the device heats up, and it's not an overly good experience. So, take that as you will. It's not going to matter to many people, but for some people who need those applications every so often in Windows, Boot Camp on this, not great. So a couple of other things that kind of need mentioning. First up, the microphones on this, really impressive actually. I've got to say, the microphones on this really surprise me. Whenever I do any form of audio calls or anything like that, people hear me really clearly. Occasionally when I've had to do some recording onto this as well, the microphones have been generally impressive. The speakers on it are phenomenal, especially for a mobile device. I absolutely love the speakers on this. It's the best thing I have heard on any mobile device pretty much ever. And to be honest, the amount of times, instead of hooking up to my Sonos and messing about with that, if I just want to listen to something, this is the way to go. Which brings us on to a massive downside of this, and it's not something that hits me that much because I don't use it particularly, but it's definitely worth bearing in mind if you're going to be the kind of person who does any kind of video calls or anything like that. The webcam on this is just awful. I don't understand it. With the tech that we have now and the cameras that they have available, why do we have such an awful webcam on this? It is grainy, it is poor, it is just abysmal, and Apple, you should be ashamed. In fact, all laptop manufacturers, you should be ashamed of yourselves. Why are you putting these cameras in our devices? Especially when they cost this much. You need to just go hang your head in shame. If you're going to be doing a lot of video conferencing or anything like this, you will probably want to invest in a separate webcam, because Apple's camera on this, it's awful, absolutely awful. I can't stress how awful it is. But yeah, as I said, it's not something that I use too much, so it doesn't really, it does bother me, clearly. I think I just had a stroke talking about it, but it's not something that impacts me much. But there are a lot of people who are going to be using this for things like Microsoft Teams, your Zoom calls, all of that, and you're going to be one that stands out and just looks awful unless you have a separate webcam. So I guess in summary, if I had the choice to buy this again for what I do, so as I said, writing throughout the day, doing some of the web development stuff as well for the Bolton gamers, and doing video creations, would this be the device that I go for? And I guess the short answer is no, it wouldn't be. At the time, it definitely suited what I needed. It was the only device that Apple had in the current lineup that had gone back to the scissor switch mechanism, and everything else was still butterfly keyboards. So there was absolutely no way that I was going to go back to those butterfly keyboards. They're appalling. Don't buy one second hand. Don't risk it. They are awful, and Apple needs an absolute backhander for it. So at the time, it was pretty much the only choice that I had. And you know what? I love it, but I also dislike it, and there are now, in my opinion, better alternatives out there. Looking back, and with the current lineup that they've got, personally, I would probably go for something like the MacBook Air and just have a a really basic level of MacBook Air for on the go for my writing and stuff like that, because I don't need anything serious in this at the end of the day. It's nice to have, especially for the media creation and all of that. But actually I would have a MacBook Air and probably something like the 27-inch iMac as well, because I'm going to get very similar, if not better horsepower from that than I am on this beastie. And overall, it's going to cost me about the same. And that would give me a nice, small, lightweight device to use around the house. And if I ever go anywhere, with the great keyboard that this thing offers me, but then it gives me a bit of a powerhouse when I'm at home with a much larger screen and more expandability with regards to ports and upgradability as well in the future. So it gives me the best of both. And although I do love this, and it's a lovely sort of in-between, for the cost and the amount that you have to pay for one of these, I personally would recommend going for something like I said, a MacBook Air and the iMac. You don't necessarily even need a MacBook. If you're doing a lot of work around the house, then go for something like the iMac and, you know, use something like the iPad as your second monitor. Hook it up to a keyboard with a trackpad and you can use that around the house and still have access to Mac OS, or do the majority of things that you need on the iPad, and then when you need a desktop OS, go over to the Mac. You know what, this thing is overkill for what I need, but I do also need it because it offers me that extra power. But now with the devices that Apple has available, it would make so much more sense for me to have something like a MacBook Air and an iMac. However, I don't regret my purchase. I absolutely love it. For what I need it for, it does a great job with that keyboard. The overall build quality is fantastic. There are a few little niggles that I've covered off there, but overall, it's an awesome package. The kind of thing that this is absolutely killer for is for those of you who are out and about, you're on the road a lot, you're traveling a lot, you're going to different meetings, and you're going to be away from that home office or just the office in general. That is when this thing is absolutely brilliant for you. It offers everything you need as a portable workstation, and it works and it is nice to use. I have really enjoyed my time with this, and like I said, I don't regret it. But given the situation and what so many people are facing at the moment, having to work from home or just be at a static office instead, having something like an iMac is probably the better purchase. Realistically, the best thing to do right now is to hold off anyway and see what they come out with Apple Silicon, but I'd go for an iMac and a MacBook Air for reasons. So anyway, I hope this video has helped you. As I said, it's more of a perspective of a writer and a creator, just to kind of give you that insight into what I've liked about this and what I've disliked about it. You know, if it has helped me, like, you know, anything else, just drop some comments in the comments below, obviously, and hit that like and subscribe button while you're at it as well, because we'll be having more videos coming in the future. In the meantime, stay safe, and we'll see you soon. Ta-ra for now. Bye.